Your Honor, opposing counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the court and jury, we are here today to prove why my client, Miss Marsha Jones, should not be convicted of murder. It is very difficult to go through life without making mistakes. I've made mistakes, and I'm pretty sure many of you have made some mistakes. If you haven't, then you know someone who has made some mistakes. Unfortunately, my client's mistake was entering an abusive relationship with Mr. Jones. My client had no way of knowing that the marriage would become so chaotic. It ended in chaos. The prosecution in this case has the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client, Marsha Jones, did not act in self-defense. Your Honor, but I have to prove here today to you that my client's actions were justifiable by her belief that such force was immediately necessary for the purpose of protecting herself against the use of unlawful force by Mr. Jones. On the evening in question, Elmer Jones stumbled in the home drunken. Marsha testified that Mr. Jones would frequently come home drunk and take his frustrations out on her. Marsha further testified that Mr. Jones's complaint on this day was that the apartment was not clean when he arrived. She and Elmer lived in a one-bedroom apartment. Now, there was no reason why he couldn't have cleaned the home himself. One can only imagine that with only the two of them living there, it couldn't be but so messy. Miss Jones testified that she worked part-time as a secretary, and Mr. Jones worked as a guard at the county jail. They worked the majority of the week, so the house cleaning was reserved for the weekends as it had always been. Many of you work, whether it's part-time or full-time. A lot of times when you get home from that job, you just want to relax. And typically, we all reserve our house cleaning for weekends. This is exactly what my defendant did. My client also informed you that Elmer Jones did not help her with the housework. It was her expectation that the two would work as a team, to no avail. I know that it is a very difficult time for Miss Jones. After being left alone for her husband to go out drinking and come home to accuse her of not cleaning, one would think that her husband would come in that time of night and attempt to avoid confusion, avoid arguments. It's 11 o'clock. You're married. Sometimes we make decisions and we have to live with the consequences for the rest of our lives. My client had been beaten and taunted by Mr. Jones. You heard testimony that he stumbled in drunken and immediately began to verbally attack my client and then proceeded to repeatedly punch her in her stomach. Now I want you to close your eyes. Yes, I want you to close your eyes and imagine for a moment that you are Marsha Jones. Imagine that you are being attacked, and boom, one punch. Boom, punch number two. Boom, boom, boom. Several force punches to your stomach or the most sensitive area of your body. And you're left lying there helpless. Now imagine that this attack comes on Monday. Then I want you to imagine that this attack comes again on Wednesday. And then again on Friday, week after week. For the better part of 8 years, she endured physical and mental abuse under the hand of her husband. Now I want you to think about the consequences you would face by calling the police when the one attacking you is to an officer himself. What do you do? What would you do? Your Honor, Marsha testified to her desperation and fear. You heard her testify that Mr. Jones routinely beat her. You even heard her testify that Mr. Jones threatened to kill her if she told anyone. So out of fear of losing her life and embarrassment to her family and friends if they found out that she has endured such trauma, no, she didn't call the police or report the repeated incidents to what she knew was his co-workers and his friends, and many battered wives do. They don't report anything because the image is that this is not happening to me. By further reasoning, no one would believe her because he's a member of law enforcement. He worked at the county jail. He would be sure to find out if anything were reported by her. Your Honor, my client has testified that she has suffered repeated abuse during their relationship. The day that Mr. Jones was shot, he was punching her in her stomach non-stop. She pleaded and begged him to stop, trying to calm him down to no avail. She even yelled at him, "Leave me alone." A beating because the house was simply not clean. Was she children? Was she their child? Was she his child? An unruly teenager being chastised? No. She's an adult, a woman whom he made vows to love and protect, but instead beat and abused. After several punches, my client fought to free herself from the blows of his hands. With just a second to think, she goes to their bedroom and grabs his revolver in hopes that once he saw her holding it, he would settle down. But that doesn't work for Mr. Jones. He taunted her more by laughing, and by her testimony, he tells her she wouldn't use that gun. Marsha Jones, as you can see, is 5'4" tall. She weighs 120 pounds. She's faced with 6'2" tall man weighing 210 pounds. who by the evidence presented was indeed intoxicated beyond the legal limit and trying to protect herself from further punches. There is no question as to what happened in that apartment 6 months ago. Marsha testified that Mr. Jones suddenly lunged at her, and in a split second, she pulled the trigger for fear that he would indeed overpower her, and then she would be looking down the barrel of that revolver. She feared losing her life, and he had threatened to kill her on so many occasions. Marsha couldn't take another beating. She chose to defend herself on this day from further punches and even death. By her testimony, by her own testimony, and the evidence presented here today, she immediately called the police. She did not flee the scene. She disclosed the details of the incident. The timeline shows that she didn't make any other calls or actions. The prosecution had a high burden to prove that Miss Jones in fact murdered Mr. Jones, and they have not done so. We ask respectfully that you do what the prosecution has not, which is to take a look at this case and to look at the facts and do the homework. The prosecution has not proved a case of murder. They have not proved that Miss Jones did not act in self-defense. Now, in a moment, you have to go back in that jury room and you have to look at all the evidence and at all the questions that have been unanswered. And when you do, it will become clear that the prosecution's conclusion came long before the facts that they used to try to make it acceptable. But it is not acceptable. It is not acceptable to go out drinking late night when you are a married man. It is not acceptable to come home and beat your wife. So I ask you today to write the conclusion that is acceptable. A conclusion that is based on the evidence laid out before you. A conclusion where the last two words are not guilty, because my client, Marsha Jones, is not guilty. Thank you.